They asked me what defines a person. For me, the answer came when I was 16 with no shoes, no home, and only $10 standing between me and the winter of 1942. I'm 75 now. My hands are spotted with age, thick with calluses that never went away. When I hold them to the fire like this, I can still see the cracks that formed that first winter, the ones that bled into frozen earth while I dug. People say I should let it go, that old anger, that old fear. But I learned something in that winter that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. The world doesn't give you anything. You have to take it. And if you're not willing to bleed for what keeps you alive, then you deserve to freeze. This is how it started. This is how a kid survived when grown men died. It was October 1942 when they threw me out. Early October before the snow, but you could feel it coming in the air, that cold dullness that meant the sky was loading up, getting ready to bury everything. I was 16 years old. My name was May Derlin, though most folks just called me the Derlin girl, or that girl or nothing at all. My mother had died the year before face down in the creek during a flash flood. She'd been trying to save our last two chickens. They drowned anyway. The news that no man claimed me passed through the town like kindling, catching flame. Within a week, I'd been moved to my first foster home, an old couple who needed help with their farm. I worked hard, kept my head down, but the wife watched me like I might steal something. 3 months later, they said I was eating too much. They sent me to another family, then another. Each one worse than the last. Each one pretending to help while their eyes followed me too long, or they blamed me for things I didn't do. Spoiled milk, broken broom, not earning my keep. The last home was my mother's own sister, my aunt. I'd thought maybe blood would mean something. It didn't. That morning in October, she'd screamed about a missing piece of cornbread. I hadn't eaten it. I hadn't eaten anything since the day before. But I didn't argue because it didn't matter anymore. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, red-faced, shaking, and pointed at the dirt road. Out. Get out. You bring nothing but trouble. She handed me a wool blanket, thin and moth-eaten, a tin cup with a dent in the side, and a small cloth bag that held maybe 2 pounds of flour. I opened it later and found it gray with mold, sour-smelling, completely useless. I stood there barefoot on her porch. The boards were cold under my feet. I could feel splinters. My aunt looked at me one last time, and I thought maybe she'd stop. Maybe she'd remember that my mother was her sister, that I was 16 and alone, and winter was coming. But she just turned and slammed the door. The sound echoed across the empty fields. I didn't cry. Not then. My tears had dried up 2 years ago when I watched them pull my mother's body from the creek. I'd cried, then cried until my throat burned and my eyes swelled shut. After that, there was nothing left. So I stood there on that porch, the blanket folded over one arm, the tin cup hooked on my finger, the bag of ruined flour dangling from my other hand. The sky was gray. The wind was picking up. And I thought about the $10 sewn into the hem of my dress. My mother had put it there 3 years ago, the last money she ever had, hidden in the stitching, where no one would think to look. $10. That was all I had in the world. I walked off that porch like the ground was shaking beneath me, but I kept walking. I headed west away from the town, away from the road toward the woods where no one bothered to go. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't stay. The families in town had always looked down on my mother and me. We were poor, but we weren't stupid. My mother had been observant in a way that most people aren't. She noticed things. She paid attention to the women. No one else looked at the ones who lived on the edges, the ones who survived when they shouldn't have. She'd shown me how Miss Glay kept her potatoes. Not in a cellar like everyone else, but under the floorboards of her kitchen, wrapped in straw and newspaper where the cold couldn't reach, but the damp couldn't rot them either. I was 8 when I saw that. My mother made me kneel down and look, made me understand why it worked. She'd shown me how old Mr. Braden stacked his kindling. Not in a shed where the rain could seep through the walls, but in a ditch he dug beside his house, lined with flat stones and sloped just right so the water ran off. Even in a downpour, his wood stayed dry. My mother had pointed it out one day when we walked past his property. She didn't say much, just nodded toward the ditch and said, "Smart man. Remember that." And she'd told me about the widow Hale, who lived in what people called a dugout half cabin and half hole in the prairie. Folks laughed at her, said she lived like an animal. But when the windstorms came and flattened every chicken coop for 5 miles, the widow didn't lose a single bird. Her dugout held. My mother had taken me there once, stood outside with me in the wind, and said, "People think they're smarter than the earth. They're not." I remembered every trick. Not the ones in books, not the ones the church ladies whispered about, but the ones desperate women learned when they had no one to call, and the frost crawled through the cracks like fingers. I walked until my legs burned, and my stomach growled so bad I couldn't think straight. I walked westward off the trail past a crag of trees no one cared about. The land dipped and rose in gentle waves, and I kept moving until I found a spot that felt right. A dry dip in the land beside a rock outcrop that jutted up like a broken tooth. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I stopped there and looked around. The trees were thin, mostly pine and scrub oak. The ground was hard-packed dirt and clay, dry and crumbly, but not frozen yet. The rock outcrop gave some shelter from the north wind, and the dip in the land meant I was low enough that I wouldn't be seen from the trail. I set down my blanket and my cup and my useless bag of flour. I sat on the ground and felt the cold seeping up through my dress. My feet were filthy cut in places from walking barefoot over rough ground. I was hungry. I was tired. And I knew that if I didn't do something smart, I'd be dead by December. I didn't want to build a cabin. I didn't have the lumber or the tools or the strength, but I knew what kept wood dry. The ground if you were smart about it. I thought about Mr. Braden's kindling ditch, about the slope and the stones. I thought about the Widow Hale's dugout, about how the earth held warmth when the wind tried to steal it. And I thought about Miss Glay's potatoes safe under the floorboards where no one thought to look. I decided right then what I was going to do. I was going to dig. Not a cellar, not a shack, a trench, low and long sloping gently from the rocky edge toward a crude rise of packed clay. A tunnel just big enough to crawl through, just tall enough to stack firewood in rows. If I could keep the wood dry, I could make fire. If I could make fire, I could survive. The first problem was tools. I didn't have a shovel. I didn't have a pickaxe. I didn't have anything except a tin cup and a blanket and $10 that wouldn't buy me much out here where there were no stores for miles. I remembered a shed I'd passed about 2 miles back near an abandoned homestead. The family had left years ago, gone west, looking for better land. The shed was half collapsed, but I'd seen tools hanging inside when I walked by. I went back for them that evening. The walk took an hour. My feet were bleeding by the time I got there. The shed door was hanging off its hinges, and inside it smelled like rot and mouse droppings. But there was a pickaxe leaning against the wall, rusty and old, but still solid. I took it. I didn't ask permission because there was no one to ask. I just took it and walked back. That night I slept under a pine tree with my blanket pulled tight around me. I could hear animals moving in the dark, the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches. I didn't sleep much. I was too cold, too scared, too aware that I was alone in a way I'd never been before. The next morning I started digging. The ground was hard, not frozen but packed tight from years of weather. I swung the pickaxe and it bounced off the surface, jarring my arms, sending pain up through my shoulders. I swung again and again. After an hour, I'd barely made a dent. But I kept going. I broke through the top layer of dirt and hit clay beneath, thick and orange and stubborn. I used the pickaxe to break it apart, then scooped it out with my hands and the tin cup. My hands started bleeding almost immediately, the skin tearing open, where I gripped the handle, where I scraped against the rough edges of the clay. By the end of the first day, I had a shallow trench, maybe 4 feet long and a foot deep. It didn't look like much. It didn't look like anything. But it was a start. I worked like that for 4 days straight. I woke up at dawn and dug until my arms gave out, then rested and dug again. I didn't eat much because I didn't have much to eat. The flour was useless, so I threw it out. I found some wild berries near the trees, bitter and small, and I ate those. I found a patch of cattails near a stream and pulled up the roots, chewed them raw, even though they tasted like mud. My dress turned brown from the dirt. My hair was matted and tangled. My knees tore open from kneeling on the rough ground, and I could feel the scabs crack every time I moved. But I didn't stop. By the 4th day, I had it. A tunnel just long enough to crawl through, maybe 10 feet from end to end. Just tall enough to stack 3 rows of wood if I ever got any wood to stack. The floor sloped gently from the rock outcrop down toward the other end so water would drain away instead of pooling inside. I'd learned that from watching Mr. Braden. I used my last dime, the very last bit of money I had to buy leftover planks from a widow who lived 5 miles east. Her husband had died the winter before, and she was selling off pieces of his broken barn for whatever she could get. I told her I needed wood for a project. She didn't ask what kind. She just took my dime and pointed to a pile of rough-cut boards. I hauled those boards back myself one at a time, dragging them across the prairie like a mule. They were heavy and awkward, and my hands were already so torn up that every grip felt like fire. But I got them back to my trench, all 6 of them, and I set to work. I split some of the boards into panels and used them to cover the top of the tunnel, laying them across like a roof. Then I packed clay and prairie grass on top, thick and heavy, until it looked like just another part of the ground. From above, you couldn't tell there was anything there. Just a bump near the rocks, just dirt and grass like everything else. Inside, I built a crude wooden rack along one wall. It wasn't pretty, just planks nailed together with stones I'd found, but it would hold firewood if I ever got any. The other side I left open for kindling and bark. At the far end of the tunnel, I carved a drainage ditch that sloped down to daylight just wide enough to let water trickle out if it rained. I'd seen something similar at the Widow Hale's place, and I knew it would keep the inside from flooding. I used an old piece of oilcloth I'd found near the abandoned homestead to cover the entrance. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind out. I packed dirt around the seams, pressed it tight with my hands, and stomped the floor flat until it was hard as stone. When I was done, I crawled inside and sat there in the dark. It smelled like dust and pine and damp earth. The ceiling was low, so low I had to hunch over, and the walls were rough and uneven. But it was mine. And more than that, it was dry. I crawled back out and looked at what I'd made. From the outside, it looked like nothing. Just a ridge of dirt near some rocks. No one would know it was there unless they were looking for it. And no one was looking for me. That night, I slept inside the tunnel for the first time. I pulled my blanket around me and curled up on the dirt floor. It was cold, colder than I'd expected, and I could feel the damp seeping up through the ground. But the wind didn't reach me. The rain, if it came, wouldn't touch me. And for the first time since my aunt had thrown me out, I felt like maybe I had a chance. The first snow came in early November. I woke up one morning to find the ground white, the air sharp and biting. My tunnel was half full by then, packed with every scrap of wood I could find. I'd scoured the edges of the trail where wagons had passed, claimed every splinter and broken branch left behind. I'd found a half-burned wood pile near an old logging camp abandoned because of a broken wagon wheel, and I'd filled my arms until my muscles gave out, trudging back and forth across the snow-laced prairie. Every piece of wood I found I stacked carefully inside the tunnel. I didn't just throw it in. I placed each log with care, leaving gaps for air to move between them. I'd remembered what my mother said once about damp wood rotting when stacked too tight. Heat's what keeps it dry, she told me. Not shelter. Heat. I had wood, but no way to light it. No matches. No flint. Just dry logs waiting for a spark I couldn't make. And then one morning I found him. A man face down in the snow, dead from the look of him. Not fresh, but not too old either. His clothes were frozen stiff, his skin gray and waxy. He had no boots. Someone had already taken those. I stood there looking at him for a long time. My stomach flipped. I hadn't seen another soul in weeks. Part of me wanted to run to get away, to pretend I'd never seen him. But I didn't run. I needed what he had. I knelt down beside him and pulled off his coat. It was heavy wool lined with some kind of fur, frozen solid but still intact. I had to work it off his arms, and the sound it made, that crackling, scraping sound, made my teeth ache. But I got it off. Then I took his satchel. It was slung across his chest, half buried in the snow. Inside were biscuits, hard as rocks, so old they cracked my tooth when I tried to bite one. And beneath the biscuits, wrapped in wax paper, was a tin box. I opened it. Inside were matches, maybe 20 of them, dry and perfect. I sat there in the snow with that tin box in my hands, and I cried. Not for the man, not from guilt. I cried because it meant I could burn wood. It meant I could survive. I buried him. Not deep, just a shallow grave near the rocks, enough to keep the animals from getting to him right away. I didn't say a prayer. I didn't know any that felt right. I just worked digging with my hands and the edge of the pickaxe, rolling him into the hole, covering him with dirt. and stones. When I was done, I took the coat and the satchel and the matches back to my tunnel, and I didn't look back. It was mid-November when I finally used those matches. I built a small fire pit from stones I'd gathered just big enough for 2 logs. When I lit my first fire, striking the match against the rough stone and watching the flame catch on dry pine shavings, it smoked bad. The tunnel filled with thick gray smoke, and I coughed until my lungs burned. But I'd angled the entrance right, and after a few minutes, the smoke began to drift out, pulled by the wind. The wood burned, clean and hot. And for the first time in weeks, I felt warmth that wasn't from my own body heat. People in town talked about me sometimes. That girl, they'd say, ran off like a stray dog. Her aunt said she must have frozen by now. But no one went looking. No one cared. Except one person. His name was Ellis Brack. He was 17, the son of a mule trader. He'd always watched me, not in the way some men did not, with that look that made my skin crawl, but with something like worry. Like he saw something in me that reminded him of someone or something he'd lost. He found me in early December, about 3 weeks before Christmas. Found me by accident following the tracks of a fox that led toward the ridge where I'd built my tunnel. He stopped when he saw smoke, thin and grow, curling up from somewhere he couldn't quite place. He called my name, May. I didn't answer. I was crouched near the entrance of the tunnel, breaking up kindling for the fire. I heard him, but I didn't move. I just watched. He stepped closer, moving carefully through the snow. He saw my face through the bare trees, sunken and thin, but alive. May, he whispered like he was seeing a ghost. I didn't cry. I just nodded. He gave me bread. Fresh bread, still warm, wrapped in cloth. He must have brought it from town, must have walked miles in the snow just to find me. I took it. I didn't say thank you. I just took it and ate. He sat down beside me, not too close, just close enough that I could see his breath in the cold air. You're alive, he said. I looked at him. Obviously. He smiled just a little. People think you're dead. Good, I said. He looked at the tunnel at the entrance, half hidden under the oilcloth, at the thin trail of smoke rising from somewhere behind the rocks. What is this, he asked. I shrugged, staying warm. He didn't ask more questions. He just sat there with me while I finished the bread. And when the sun started to set, he stood up and said, I'll come back. He did. A few days later, he came with more food. Dried meat wrapped in wax paper, sugar in a small cloth bag, a pair of wool socks too big for me, but better than nothing. Town folks talk, he said. They saw smoke near the ridge. They're curious. I looked at him. Let them be curious. Ellis came back regularly after that. Not every day, but often enough that I started to expect him. He'd appear through the trees with a sack over his shoulder, moving quiet like he didn't want anyone to follow. He never stayed long, just handed me whatever he'd brought, bread or meat or once a small jar of honey, and sat for a while watching me work. He helped me gather more wood one afternoon in early December. We didn't talk much, just worked side by side, him breaking branches and me bundling them, moving through the forest like we'd done this 100 times before. When we got back to the tunnel, he looked at what I'd built with something close to respect. You did this yourself, he asked. Who else would, I said. He shook his head. My father's got a whole shed for his tools, and it leaks every time it rains. This doesn't leak at all. That's because I dug down, not up, I said. Water falls. It doesn't rise. He looked at me like I'd said something profound, but it wasn't profound. It was just obvious. People built up because they wanted to be seen. I built down because I wanted to survive. Less than a week after Ellis first found me, his father discovered where he'd been going. Ellis had come home late one evening, his cheeks wind-bitten and his hands black with soot from helping me move firewood. His father was waiting. Where have you been? His father demanded, Ellis stubborn as his dead mother told him the truth. May Derlin's alive. His father's face went dark. That girl's trouble. You stay away from her. No, Ellis said. It was the first time he'd refused his father outright. I heard about it later third hand from a boy who delivered flour to the trading post. Ellis's father had threatened him, told him he'd be thrown out if he kept visiting me. But Ellis kept coming anyway. I never asked him why. Part of me didn't want to know. If it was pity, I didn't want it. If it was something else, I didn't want that either. I just needed the food and the help, and he seemed willing to give both without asking for anything in return. That was enough. Less than 2 weeks after Ellis found me, two men came looking. I saw them from a distance riding horses across the snowy prairie toward the ridge. They had shovels strapped to their saddles and rifles across their backs. I knew what they were looking for. Me, my tunnel, my wood. I crawled inside and pulled the oilcloth curtains shut. The tunnel went dark. I sat there in the blackness with my hatchet in my hands, barely breathing. My fire had gone out earlier, and I hadn't relit it yet, afraid the smoke would give me away. The air smelled like cold ash and damp earth. I could hear them outside, boots crunching in the snow, voices low and rough. Got to be around here somewhere. Tracks stop right near this ridge. Maybe she's under the ground. Some kind of foxhole. Tunnel girl. That's what they call her. I pressed myself against the wall, my fingers wrapped tight around the hatchet handle. If they found the entrance, if they pulled back the curtain, I didn't know what I'd do. Fight probably. Lose definitely. But I wasn't going to let them take it without trying. One of them kicked at the ground near the entrance. I felt the vibration through the dirt. My heart hammered so hard I thought they'd hear it. "Ain't nothing but snow and dirt out here," one of them said. The other spat. I heard it hit the frozen ground. Boy seeing ghosts. Probably dead by now anyway. They left. I heard the horses' hooves fade into the distance, and still I didn't move. I sat there for an hour, maybe more, until I was sure they were gone. Then I crawled out and looked at the marks their boots had left in the snow less than 5 feet from my entrance. That's when I knew I couldn't trust anyone. Not fully, not even Ellis, though he'd never done anything but help me. Because people talk, and talk leads to curiosity, and curiosity leads to men with rifles. Ellis came back 3 days later. He brought sugar and wool socks and jerky wrapped in wax paper. I took them, but I didn't smile. I didn't thank him. "They came looking," I said. His face fell. "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just be careful." He nodded. "I will." But careful wasn't enough. The town was talking. Whispers about a girl who'd survived somehow, who'd built something smart, who had heat when others were freezing. I could feel it in the air, that dangerous mix of curiosity and envy. I started setting traps. Not to kill, just to warn. I laid flat stones on hidden springs near the entrance, baited with bits of jerky I couldn't afford to spare. If someone stepped wrong, the stone would snap up and catch their ankle. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to make them think twice. I strung thorns across the blind approaches, low to the ground where you wouldn't see them in the snow. I scattered broken glass in the clay lip of the entrance, hidden under a thin layer of dirt. Just enough to cut if you weren't careful. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted them to leave me alone. By mid-December, the cold had settled in for real. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in your lungs, that turns your fingers black if you're not careful. I kept my fire small and controlled, burning only what I needed, saving the rest. I'd learned to coax a blaze from just a handful of shavings and a piece of pine resin. One match. That's all it took. And then it got worse. The news came through Ellis. Old Mr. Harper's cabin had caught fire. He'd been trying to dry his firewood too close to the stove, and the whole thing went up. 3 people dead, Mr. Harper, his wife, and their grandson, who'd been staying with them. Ellis told me while we stood outside the tunnel in the bitter wind. His face was pale, his voice quiet. "They burned trying to get warm," he said. I looked at him, then at my tunnel, my low, half-buried trench covered in dirt and grass and cleverness. "You were the only one smart enough to build underground," he said. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, for Mr. Harper and his family. But another part, the part that remembered being thrown out with nothing, the part that remembered my aunt slamming the door, that part felt something else. Not joy exactly, just a cold, hard certainty. I was right, and they were wrong. I smiled. It was the first time in months. I was 16 years old. I had no family, no food, no shoes, but I had fire. And fire, I was learning, was everything. The winter of 1942 killed more people than Hitler did that year. But it wasn't the snow that killed them. It was stupidity. I learned that watching from my tunnel while the town fell apart. Men who thought they knew better than the earth, women who trusted walls more than wisdom, children who paid for their parents' pride. The cold didn't care about your house or your name or how much land you own. It only cared if you were smart enough to survive it. By late November, my tunnel was half full of firewood. Not because I was lucky, because I worked. Every morning I woke before dawn and walked the edges of the old wagon trail, picking up splinters and broken branches that travelers had left behind. Pieces no one else wanted because they were too small, too crooked, too much work to carry. But I carried them, every single one. I found a logging camp 2 miles north that had been abandoned when their wagon wheel broke. They'd left behind a pile of half-burned wood charred on one end, but still good on the other. I made 12 trips back and forth, filling my arms until my muscles gave out, dragging loads across snow-laced prairie until my legs shook. Each time I added wood to the tunnel, I stacked it carefully with gaps between the logs so air could move through. Heat's what keeps it dry, my mother had said. I never forgot. The people in town had their sheds and their covered porches and their neat stacks of cordwood lined up against their cabin walls. But when the rain came in late November, mixed with sleet and wind, their wood got wet, soaked through. They tried to dry it by their furs, but wet wood doesn't burn right. It smokes and hisses and gives off almost no heat. I could smell it in the air when I got close to town, that thick, choking smoke of desperation. My wood stayed dry, every single piece. And when I needed fire, it lit with one match. Ellis had already told his father about me weeks ago. The confrontation had been ugly, his father threatening to throw him out if he kept visiting. But Ellis kept coming anyway, stubborn, as his dead mother unwilling to abandon someone who needed help. He helped me gather more wood one afternoon in early December. We didn't talk much, just worked side by side, him breaking branches and me bundling them, moving through the forest like we'd done this 100 times before. When we got back to the tunnel, he looked at what I'd built with something close to respect. "You did this yourself?" he asked. "Who else would?" I said. He shook his head. "My father's got a whole shed for his tools, and it leaks every time it rains. This doesn't leak at all. That's because I dug down, not up," I said. "Water falls, it doesn't rise." He looked at me like I'd said something profound, but it wasn't profound. It was just obvious. People built up because they wanted to be seen. I built down because I wanted to survive. That night, Ellis went home late. His cheeks were wind-bitten, and his hands were black with soot from helping me move the firewood. When I asked him the next day if his father had said anything, he just shrugged. He's given up trying to control me, I think. Ellis leaned closer to the fire. "You could teach them. The town. They'd listen now." "No," I said. The word came out harder than I meant it to. "Why not?" "Because they'd take. That's what they do. Take and forget." He was quiet for a long moment. "You really think that I know it?" I said. "I've lived it." But rumors traveled anyway. By the end of December, people were whispering about the tunnel girl. No one knew exactly where I was. No one could find me, but they knew I existed. A few people had been inside. Word spread in the way it always does in small towns. Whispers at the general store. Murmurs after church. "She's alive and she's smart," one old man said outside the saloon. "Built something under the earth, that girl did. Something clever. Girl like that ought to be married," someone joked. "She don't need no man," another replied. "She's got heat." They laughed, but beneath it was something sharper. Envy. Resentment. That dangerous edge of pride wounded by truth. Because a 16-year-old girl with no family and no home had figured out what they couldn't, and that made them look like fools. Ellis heard everything. He always listened, always brought back news. "You might need to hide it better," he told me one morning in early January. "It's already buried," I said. "I mean the trail. The path people are starting to follow." I thought about that for a moment. Then I knew what to do. "We'll flood it." It took 4 days, but Ellis and I rerouted meltwater through a shallow ditch we carved by hand. We angled it just right so the runoff pulled over the main approach to the tunnel entrance, then let it freeze into a smooth sheet of glare ice. Anyone trying to walk up would slip, fall, give up. Then I did something no one expected. I put up a marker, a crude wooden sign barely readable with just 3 words carved in jagged strokes. "No fire here." It made people turn back. And the ones who didn't, who dared come closer, well, the thorns were still strung across the blind approaches. The glass was still scattered in the entrance. The spring traps were still hidden in the moss. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I would not be thrown out again. Not from the one place I'd built with my own hands. January came like a wolf. The snow fell so thick and fast that some mornings I couldn't see more than 10 feet from the tunnel entrance. The main trail from town got buried twice. A team of horses froze upright in the saddle yard behind the tavern, standing there dead with frost rhyming their hides like flour. Every man with a cabin was burning damp logs, coughing up smoke, praying for a thaw that never came. Glass cracked in window panes, ink froze in bottles. Children's fingers turned purple if they touched a metal latch too long. But my firewood buried deep in that clever trench I'd built with bleeding hands stayed dry. And I stayed warm, not comfortable. I was never comfortable. My body was thin as rope, my cheeks hollow, my ribs showing through my dress. But I was alive, and that was more than some people could say. The tunnel became more than just storage. It became my home. I lined one side with cloth sacks I'd found abandoned near the old homestead, stuffed them with dried grass for insulation. I added bark as bedding in the corner, thick enough to keep the cold from seeping up through the ground. The low ceiling held the heat in, and I learned not to waste a single flame. I rationed every log like it was gold. 2 logs a night, no more. I'd light them at dusk and let them burn slow, then bury the coals under ash to save the heat. In the morning, I'd blow on the embers and add kindling, coaxing the fire back to life without using another match. Ellis came twice more in January. The first time, he just brought beans and tallow and watched me work. I was stacking fresh pine I'd gathered after a storm of steam, still rising from my back because I'd been hauling wood for hours. He didn't try to help, just stared at my hands red with cold but moving fast and sure. "Why a tunnel?" he asked finally. I kept working. Because a pile above ground turns to sponge. I've seen it. What about under the cabin? Under the floorboards, rots against the wood. Ice gets in the cracks. But dig the right slope line. It right, bury it right. I patted the clay roof above us, and you got your fire waiting all winter. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "No one else thought of it," he said quietly. I shrugged. "They don't have to. They got families, fathers to stack their cords, men to cut and haul." Ellis didn't answer. He just looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, like he knew he was seeing something rare. A girl who'd figured out what grown men couldn't. The second time he came, he brought news that made my blood cold. "Some families are running out of wood," he said. "Men with hands too frozen to swing an axe. They're burning fences now, digging up roots, anything they can find." I nodded. Sounds about right. But what they find is soaked through. Branches covered in frost, bark peeling from rot, nothing dry. "And mine's still good," I said. It wasn't a question. Every piece he confirmed. I looked at him. Then they should have been smarter. He flinched at that, not from anger, just from the truth of it, because we both knew I was right. They'd had all summer and fall to prepare. They'd had roofs and walls and strong backs, and they'd wasted it assuming winter would be assuming they'd have enough, assuming the world owed them something. I'd assumed nothing, and I'd survived. One night I woke to voices. Close. Too close. I blew out my fire immediately, my heart hammering in my chest. Ain't no way she made it out here. Just a story the boy tells to feel like a man. Still, I seen smoke. Smoke comes from lightning, too. Or devils. They laughed. I didn't. I sat in the darkness holding my hatchet, barely breathing, until their voices faded into the wind. After that, I didn't sleep right for days. The next morning, I went out looking for firewood. The storm had died down enough to walk, and I needed to replenish what we'd burned. I found her 2 miles out near the old creek bed, a woman chopping at frozen branches with a dull hatchet. She had a child strapped to her back with strips of cloth, and another crouched in the snow behind her, trying to light wet twigs with shaking hands. I watched for a moment. The woman turned. Our eyes met. She flinched, raised the hatchet slightly defensive. "I won't take," I said. She hesitated. Then I got nothing to take. I looked at the hatchet, at the pile of useless wet wood, at the boys shivering in the snow. "Come with me," I said. "Why?" Her voice was hard, suspicious. I looked away. Couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Because I was you once. That night, 7 people slept in my tunnel. 2 fires burned low. The smoke drifted up through the vents, hidden and clean. And I realized something had changed. The tunnel wasn't just mine anymore. The woman's name was Junie, and her boy was Caleb. She told me her story while we sat by the fire that first night. Her husband had frozen beside their campfire during an unexpected cold snap in December. She'd watched him stiffen, watched his breath slow and then stop altogether. Caleb had been there too, had seen it all, and he hadn't spoken since. 60 days of silence. Not a word, not a sound. Just those wide eyes staring at nothing. But inside the tunnel, something shifted in him. Maybe it was the warmth. Maybe it was the safety. Maybe it was just time. He started humming first, not words, just little tunes while he crouched near the fire. Then he began dragging twigs across the clay floor, scratching patterns and shapes that reminded me of things I used to draw when my mother was alive. One morning in late January, Caleb reached into the bark pile and pulled out a perfect pine cone. He walked over to me and held it out. "Fire treat," he said. I almost dropped the pot I was holding. Junie's hand went to her mouth. Those were the first words he'd spoken in 2 months. I took the pine cone from him and smiled. "Best treat I ever got," I told him. He smiled back. A real smile, the kind that reaches your eyes. Junie cried that night, quiet sobs she tried to muffle in her blanket. I didn't say anything. Just let her cry. Sometimes that's all people need. Permission to feel something other than fear. Ellis had grown thinner. Not from sickness that had passed weeks ago thanks to a bark tea Junie knew how to make, but from exhaustion. He worked the tunnel with me, hauled wood from miles out, carried sacks of moss for insulation, laid stones for the heating trenches. And then he'd walk back into town like he'd done nothing at all. He told no one where he went. But his mother knew. She had to know. She knows he told me one night while we sat watching the fire. But she won't say. Why not, I asked. Because I came home the other night with warm hands. She hasn't had those in years. February came, and it was the worst month anyone could remember. A dry freeze, the kind that sucked the air out of your lungs and turned everything brittle. Wells iced over, outhouses cracked, chickens froze mid-strut, found dead in their coops with their eyes wide open. I kept everyone inside for 5 days straight. The tunnel fire ran low, but it never went out. We burned only what we had to cook once in the morning, then buried the coals under ash to save heat. Even Caleb stopped humming. It was too cold to move, too cold to do anything but huddle and wait. On the 6th day, Ellis heard them. Voices, close. They got to be here somewhere. Tracks stopped right near this ridge. I heard they were under the ground. Tunnel girl, that's what they call her. Maybe she got room. Maybe she's got wood. Maybe she don't got a choice anymore. I grabbed my hatchet. Ellis blocked me. Don't. Not yet. They're coming, I said. They're cold. Desperate. Like you were. I didn't take. I spat. I built. Ellis nodded slowly. Then let them see what you built. But on your terms. I waited until dusk. Then I opened the curtain, stepped out into the bitter wind, and stood tall on the icy ridge above my hidden entrance. They saw me, 5 men bundled in coats and scarves. One I recognized, my aunt's neighbor. The others I didn't know. They looked stunned, like they were seeing a ghost. I held the hatchet low, not threatening, but not hiding it either. "You want warmth," I shouted over the wind. They glanced at each other. "Then you earn it. No noise, no fire unless I say. You bring food bark twigs. You don't touch what's not yours, and you leave before sunrise." The tallest one started forward. I raised the hatchet slightly. "You step out of line once and you freeze," he paused, then nodded. That night, 3 of them slept in a side tunnel Ellis and I had dug the week before. They were quiet, grateful. In the morning, they left a sack of oats, some deer hide, and a piece of flint. It was my first trade. My first proof that what I'd built mattered not just to me, but to others. And standing there watching them walk away into the snow, I realized something. The girl who'd been thrown out at 16 with nothing but a blanket and $10 had built something the whole town needed. They'd tried to bury me, but I'd buried myself first. And that made all the difference. They asked me if I have regrets. I tell them only one. I regret thinking I could ever trust people completely again. But that's not entirely true. The real regret is smaller, sharper. I regret the moment I let myself believe that survival was enough, that keeping warm and staying alive meant I'd won. Because the world doesn't stop testing you just because you pass the first exam. It keeps pushing, keeps taking, keeps demanding proof that you deserve to be here. March came, and the tunnel had become something I never planned. It wasn't just mine anymore. The confrontation with the 5 men had changed things. Word spread faster after that. People knew now that the tunnel existed, that I was real, that I had rules and I'd enforce them. By then we had 12 people rotating through, not permanent. That would have been too dangerous, too loud, too obvious. But enough that I had to make rules, had to enforce them, had to become something more than just a girl trying to survive. I became the one who decided, who stayed, who left, who deserved warmth, and who deserved the cold. That power, small as it was, changed me. Junie stayed. She and Caleb had nowhere else to go, and I'd grown used to having them around. Junie was practical good with her hands, and she knew things I didn't. How to make soap from ash and fat, how to brew tea from bark that eased coughs and aches, how to repair torn cloth so it looked almost new. Caleb had started talking more. Real words now, not just hums. He'd tell stories while we worked strange little tales about foxes and birds that he made up from nothing. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling while I listened, and I'd have to remind myself not to get too comfortable. Comfort made you weak. Comfort made you forget. The tunnel became more than storage. It became school and sanctuary and defiance, all wrapped into one buried corridor of clay and timber. Junie taught the children who passed through how to braid rope from dried grass. A woman named Noreen started coming back every week with small amounts of sugar she'd traded for in town, never saying where she got the warmth to survive, but we all knew. Ella spent the next 3 nights digging with me. Together we expanded the tunnel sideways, built small sleeping nooks, laid straw in the floor gap, added another stone trench for heating. We created a separate fire pit with its own vent hidden behind brush and buried in ash to reduce the glow. When we were done, Ella stood back and looked at it all. "This is better than my father's shed," he said quietly. I didn't laugh, just nodded, because it was true. "Storms will hit again," I said, "faster this time. People aren't ready. Some are listening now." "Listening doesn't mean acting," I told him. The preacher's wife came one afternoon in mid-March. She stood at the edge of the ridge with her hat in her hands, tears frozen to her cheeks. I knew who she was. Everyone did. She was the one who'd called my mother a sinner from the church steps. The one who'd said I was cursed when my mother died. "Please," she said when she saw me, her voice cracked. "My husband's sick. We're going to die. Please." I looked at her for a long time, long enough that she started to cry harder, long enough that Ellis, standing behind me, shifted uncomfortably. "Go back," I said finally. "What?" "You heard me. Go back. But we'll freeze. You said I was cursed," I told her. "You said my mother deserved what happened to her. You said I'd bring nothing but trouble." The woman fell to her knees in the snow. I didn't know, she sobbed. "Please." I didn't know. "Yes, you did," I said, and I closed the curtain. Ellis was quiet for a long time after she left. We sat by the fire, neither of us speaking. Finally, he said, "You'll have to choose. Choose who you let in, who you leave out." I stared into the flames. "I've already chosen. And you want to be like them, like the people who threw you out." "No," I said slowly. "I want to outlive them." He didn't respond to that. What could he say? I was right, and we both knew it. The world had taught me that kindness without boundaries was just another word for weakness. And I would not be weak. Not anymore. March turned to April, and the worst of the winter finally began to break. The wind stopped screaming. The snow started to melt instead of just piling higher. One morning I woke up and stepped outside to find the sky a pale blue, the kind of blue that meant spring was coming, whether winter liked it or not. By then the tunnel had kept more than 20 people alive, some for just a night, others for weeks. None of them left the same way they came in. They all learned something about fire, about survival, about the difference between what you think you need and what actually keeps you breathing. And I learned something too. I learned that I wasn't just a girl anymore. Hadn't been for a long time, really. Not since the day I'd stood barefoot on my aunt's porch with nothing but $10 and a choice. I could have laid down and died. A lot of people would have, but I didn't. I dug. The first time I walked into town openly was in late April. The snow had mostly melted, leaving the ground muddy and soft. I walked with Ellis beside me, both of us quiet, both of us watching the faces of the people we passed. They stared. Of course they stared. Some said nothing, just watched with wide eyes. A few nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, maybe respect. One woman crossed herself like I was something unholy. Another muttered witch under her breath, but not loud enough that I was supposed to hear. The preacher lifted his hat when we walked past the church. I didn't acknowledge him, just kept walking. My aunt was in front of the general store when I came around the corner. We saw each other at the same time. She froze her hand halfway to her mouth. I looked at her, really looked. Saw the lines around her eyes, the way her dress hung loose like she'd lost weight, the tremble in her fingers. She looked away first. I kept walking. That same week, someone posted a notice at the general store. I saw it when I went to trade some rabbit pelts for salt. The notice was written in rough handwriting on a piece of brown paper pinned to the board where people advertise work or livestock for sale. Seeking advice on underground firewood storage. Winter took 3 families. We will listen now. Ellis saw me reading it and smiled. They're ready to learn. I pulled the notice down, folded it, and put it in my pocket. Let them dig their own tunnels, I said. But I didn't disappear. Didn't go back to hiding. That spring, I helped a widow lay stones in her root cellar, showed her the right angle so water would drain instead of pool. I told a young boy how to stack pine with gaps for air. I walked through the church square on Sundays, never lingering, but never hiding either. And when a man stopped me by the well one morning, a new settler, nervous and green, and asked, "You're the tunnel girl, aren't you?" I just nodded. "My firewood rotted last winter," he said. "Lost half my supply. I'd pay good money to know what you did." I looked at him, studied his face. He seemed honest enough, desperate but not entitled. "Slope your floor," I said. "Angle your vent. Cover the top with clay, not dirt. Dirt melts in spring and lets water through. Clay holds. And don't stack tight. Air between the logs is what keeps them dry, not shelter." He pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil stub, scribbled it down like I was reciting scripture. When he looked up, his eyes were grateful. "How much do I owe you?" Hubbingham said. "Just remember where you learned it." He nodded and walked away. I watched him go and felt something strange. Not pride exactly, just a quiet satisfaction that what I knew, what I'd learned through blood and cold and terror, might keep someone else alive. By the time my 17th birthday came around in late May, 5 families had given me things in trade. A sack of potatoes, a basket of eggs. One man even carved me a new pickaxe handle, smooth and balanced better than the broken one I'd been using. All in exchange for a few words of advice, for knowledge I'd earned with torn hands and sleepless nights. I didn't call it a business. I barely called it anything. But it was something, a beginning maybe, a foundation. Ellis made the expansion happen. While I was teaching people about drainage and airflow, he was digging. Another side tunnel, this one for storing dried meat and salt. I found him one afternoon 3 feet down, covered in clay and sweat, and I almost told him to stop. Almost said it was enough, that we didn't need more space. But then I remembered the preacher's wife on her knees in the snow. Remembered the way my aunt had looked away. Remembered every single person who turned their back when I needed help. "We might need this," I said instead. Ellis looked up at me and grinned. That's what I figured. When he fell asleep that evening, boots still on ash on his cheeks, I didn't wake him. Just stoked the fire low and leaned against the rock wall until he stirred on his own. "Why'd you help me?" I asked when his eyes opened. Not quite a whisper, but close. He was quiet for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Because no one else did." It was the simplest answer, and the truest. That autumn, before the leaves had even finished turning, the first frost hit. Early, sudden, caught half the town off guard. The preacher's son slipped on creek ice and cracked a rib. 2 chickens froze solid in their coop before sunrise. And people remembered. Remembered what had happened the year before. Remembered who had survived and who hadn't. By then, my buried quarter was almost 30 feet long, braced with beams Ellis had helped me scavenge from a collapsed mill barn outside town. Each post was set in clay, tamped tight. Each wall was packed with dirt and straw to prevent sagging when the spring melt came. We'd even lined one section with flat rock slabs to reinforce it. Ellis paused one day while we were working and just looked at it all. "This is better than my father's shed," he said. I didn't laugh, just nodded. Because it was true. The first real storm came in November. Wet snow mixed with winds so sharp it ripped bark from trees and knocked fences flat. The Brantleys lost 3 cows. The widow Moore woke to 3 feet of drift against her door. A chimney collapsed near the schoolhouse and nearly killed a teacher. But Ellis and I had prepared. The tunnel was full, divided into zones, one for dry logs, one for kindling, one for damp wood that needed to be dried near the fire vent. I'd even built a narrow heating trench, a one-person alcove lined with stones I could warm by the fire and seal off at night with a thick hide flap. When the storm hit, we waited it out underground. I cooked dried beans and elk jerky over a slow flame. The smoke vent worked perfectly, drawing the air up and out through the hidden exit we'd buried under brush. The wind screamed overhead, shaking the ground, but inside it stayed warm enough that I could sleep without my boots. Ellis woke on the third day and stepped outside. Snow was banked up to his chest. "Town's going to be half dead," he muttered. I stared into the fire. "Then they'll come." They did. More people this time. Noreen came back with her sister. The boy with frostbite from the year before, grown taller now, but still thin. An old woman I didn't know. 2 more children siblings who clutched each other and didn't speak. And then others. People I'd never seen. People who'd heard stories. People who were desperate enough to swallow their pride and ask a 17-year-old girl for help. I let them in. Not all of them. Not the ones who demanded. Not the ones who acted entitled. But the ones who asked with honesty, who brought what they could, who followed the rules, those I helped. By December, the tunnel system had expanded again. Ellis had dug a third wing smaller just for storage. We kept extra bark there, dried moss for insulation, jars of preserved food people had traded. We'd added another vent shaft angled to draw smoke through a different hidden exit, so no one could track us by following the trail of smoke. When Ellis saw all the changes, he shook his head in disbelief. "You built yourself a whole second house." I wiped the clay from my hands. "Better than one with a leaky roof." Then I added softer. "At least mine stays dry." Spring didn't bring relief that year either. It brought rot. Families in town found their basements full of water, their firewood spongy and black. Mold crept up walls. Food spoiled fast. But my tunnel, with its careful slope and drainage ditches, stayed dry. The jars stayed sealed. The logs stayed crisp. Even my matches, kept in a clay pot near the back wall, lit without a hiss. Ellis found out about the second tunnel by accident that summer. He'd been tracking a deer through the woods and stumbled onto freshly turned earth half a mile from the main tunnel. When he followed it, he found another entrance, smaller, better hidden. He didn't say anything for 3 days. Then one morning while we were working, he asked quietly, "How long have you been digging that one?" "Since last winter," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him. "Because if something happens to you, I need to know I still have a place that's mine." His face fell. "You think I'd tell?" "No," I said. "But I also didn't think my aunt would throw me out. I didn't think the town would let me starve. I was wrong about a lot of things, Ellis. I won't be wrong about survival." He nodded slowly. "I understand." And he did. That's why he stayed. One day in May, a man came riding up to the ridge. Not Ellis. Not anyone I recognized. He was from downriver, from one of the sawmills. He dismounted and walked the perimeter, circling the area where the tunnel was buried. I watched him from behind the brush, my hand on the hatchet. He didn't see me, just stood over the patch of ground that hid the entrance and kicked at it once, then twice. "Damn thing's solid," he muttered to himself. He must have seen the clay pack, the unnatural ridge shape. He leaned down to touch the dirt, ran his fingers over it, like he was trying to figure out what it was. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Finally, he stood up, sniffed the air like he could smell something, and walked back to his horse. He rode off without looking back. I told Ellis that night. His face went dark. "You want me to stay?" "Keep watch." "No," I said, too obvious. "But maybe leave a warning near the trail." He did, carved a rough message into a piece of bark and nailed it to a tree where the path turned toward my ridge. "Trespass and freeze." It wouldn't stop everyone, but maybe it would make them think twice. Word kept spreading, whispers about a girl who'd built something smart, about a buried cache of firewood that never went wet, about heat in the coldest winter anyone could remember. I knew how gossip worked. First it was a joke, then a tall tale, then someone came looking to steal it. So I began to trap more seriously. The spring traps got sharper, the thorn vines got thicker. I laid broken glass along every approach I could think of, hidden just under the surface where boots would find it. Not enough to kill, just enough to warn. My tunnel stayed untouched. That summer came late, and when it finally arrived, the town bore the scars. Peeling paint, collapsed porches, roofs that sagged in the middle from the weight of snow they'd barely survived. Some men limped from frostbite that had never fully healed. Others didn't come back from the woods at all, lost to the cold or to accidents no one talked about. I emerged from my tunnel like a root pushing up through thawed ground. My skin was pale from months underground. My frame was lean, almost gaunt. But my eyes were bright, alert, alive. The people who'd once thrown me away, who'd called me cursed, who'd shut their doors in my face, they looked away when I passed. That week, the town council sent a boy to the ridge with a message. It was short, written on a scrap of paper. Would you come speak to us? I read it twice. Then I walked to the fire pit and held the corner of the paper to the flames, watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. Ellis was sitting nearby. He'd seen what I did but didn't comment. They want to give you a seat, he said after a moment. On the council, I know. You going to take it? No. Why not? I stared at the ashes floating up through the vent. Because I don't want their approval. I want them to remember what they did. Ellis nodded. He understood. Some things you don't forgive. You just outlive them. By the time autumn came around again, 3 more families had dug their own underground storage. None of them did it quite right. The angles were wrong, or the venting was poor, or they'd used dirt instead of clay on the roof. But they tried, and some of them learned. I started trading advice more formally. Not for money. Money rusts, I told people. But I'd take tools, sharpening stones, bundles of bark and moss I collected during the warm months. Once a man gave me a whole smoked ham in exchange for spending an afternoon showing him how to brace tunnel walls. They started calling me different things. The clay builder, the tunnel widow, even though I'd never married and wasn't a widow. Some just called me May again, but with a different tone. Not dismissive, not pitying, just respectful. When the snows came that next year, as everyone knew they would, I was ready. I had the second tunnel by then deeper in the woods, a backup, because I'd learned not to trust luck. The first time I had something good, it was taken from me. The second time I built it from the dirt with blood on my fingers and smoke in my lungs. I would never be caught without fire again. Ellis carved me something that spring. A rough plaque made of cedar with letters burned deep into the wood. The place that stayed warm. I didn't hang it where anyone could see, but I kept it, tucked it into a small niche I'd carved in the tunnel wall behind the fire pit where only I would know it was there. And sometimes when the wind howled and the snow battered the earth above and the rest of the world was cracking under the weight of ice, I'd look at that sign and remember what it meant. Not just warmth, will. Because the girl who was thrown out at 16 with nothing but a tin cup and $10 in the hem of her dress, she'd built something no storm could touch. And every log that burned, every flame that caught every person who made it through the winter, because of what I'd taught them, they were all proof of the same thing. They hadn't buried me. Not then, not ever. I'm 75 years old now. My hands are thick with age, spotted and gnarled, but they're still strong. Strong enough to split wood. Strong enough to dig if I need to. People ask me what the secret was, how I knew to build it right when everyone else got it wrong. I tell them there was no secret, just work, just paying attention, just remembering what my mother taught me and what poverty showed me and what desperation forced me to learn. They ask me how I survived when grown men died. I tell them the truth. Men died because they thought the world owed them something, thought their strength or their name or their property meant they'd be safe. But the cold doesn't care about any of that. It only cares if you're smart enough to respect it. They ask me if I ever forgave the people who threw me out. I don't answer that one, because forgiveness is complicated. It's not a switch you flip. It's not something you do once and it's done. Some days I think I've forgiven them. Other days, when I remember standing barefoot on that porch with a bag of moldy flour in my hands, I know I haven't. But I outlived them, most of them anyway. My aunt died 10 years after that first winter pneumonia in her lungs, because her cabin was too drafty, and she was too proud to ask for help. The preacher's wife made it longer, but she never looked me in the eye again. Died quiet in her sleep, which was more mercy than some people got. Ellis is still alive. Older now, like me, but still strong in the ways that matter. He married late, had kids who are grown now with kids of their own. But he still comes by, sometimes sits with me by the fire, doesn't say much. We don't need to. We both remember. I never married, never wanted to, never needed to. I built my life with my own hands, and I'll be damned if I let anyone tell me that wasn't enough. The tunnel is still there, you know. Not the original one. That collapsed years ago when the timbers finally gave out. But I built another one, and another, each one better than the last, each one teaching me something new. And now I have this house built proper with walls and a roof and windows that don't leak. But out back in the corner of the yard where the old oak tree grows, there's a small door set into the ground. It leads down to a storage tunnel lined with stone and timber, vented properly, sloped just right. Inside, there are stacks of firewood, all dry, all ready. I open that door sometimes just to check, make sure everything's still dry, still ready. And when I'm down there in the dark with the smell of earth and pine around me, I remember what it felt like to be 16 and alone and terrified. I remember digging until my hands bled. Remember the first fire that lit with a stolen match. Remember the faces of the people who said I wouldn't make it. They thought they'd buried me when they threw me out. But I buried myself first, on my terms, in a place of my own making. And that's what survival is. Not luck, not prayer, not waiting for someone to save you. It's digging when your hands bleed. It's building when you have nothing. It's refusing to dig just because the world expects you to. They threw me out at 16 with $10 in a bag of moldy flour. 75 years later, I'm still here, still warm, still building. They never buried me.